Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a cold Tuesday evening, and it's so great to see this lively, warm crowd here. I'm very impressed, and Bruce is totally worth it, right? So thanks for being here. My name is Dr. Sarita Kwok. I serve as the Dean of the Adams School of Music and the Arts. And I'm just delighted to welcome you here on behalf of Gordon College and the Adams School for an amazing launch of Bruce's latest book, Makers by Nature. Professor Herman taught and curated exhibitions at Gordon College from 1984 to 2023. He was the founding chair of the art department, which he began in 1988. He also held the Lothlorien Distinguished Chair in the Fine Arts, which was Gordon's first endowed faculty appointment. And in his time at Gordon, in addition to teaching, founding the art department, founding the art gallery, curating exhibitions, growing Gordon's art collection, he was also instrumental in launching the Gordon and Orvieto program, which just celebrated its 25th anniversary. So needless to say, he's a very special person here on this campus, and we're delighted to be able to celebrate him and this book this evening. So thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome Bruce up to the stage, as well as Bill Cross, longtime friend of Gordon College and of Bruce, and himself a distinguished author. So join me in welcoming Bruce and Bill. Good being here.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I should probably tell some of you don't know, I lost my hearing entirely overnight about 2 years ago. And so I don't actually hear anymore, but I have a cochlear implant, which is this amazing technology that takes sound and translates it into electrical signals, which somehow my brain miraculously decodes. So when we get to a question and answer period, I may need to have someone tell me what you've asked, because I couldn't hear anything you just said, Sarita. I'm sure it was great. I thought maybe it'd be good to just spend a couple minutes talking about the title of the book. First off, I want to say I did not come up with this title. The editors at IVP Academic suggested it. My title was kind of obscure and professorial. It was An Unguarded Gaze. But actually that phrase, an unguarded gaze, is something I want to talk about a little bit tonight. The idea of being able to let down your guard and be present to whatever you're looking toward. And I make a distinction between looking toward or looking at. I won't go into it in depth, but I'll just say this, that when you look toward our world and toward one another, you're addressing the world in relationship. You're not objectifying that other person or that landscape and making it your object. You're actually entering into relationship. And that's at the heart of everything I want to do as an artist, everything I want to talk about tonight. But I like the title the publisher gave it. They lifted it out of one of my letters in the book. And maybe you know this book is actually not a typical academic essay. It's an epistolary essay, which is essentially just letters that are written, fictional letters, to usually fictional individuals. But there's a little twist in my book, which is that these are to real people. And so I told the publisher, well, we're going to sell 20 books because they can't get their letters unless they buy the book. But why Makers by Nature? Well, this is what I'm thinking. Everybody is born an artist. And if you have any question about that, just visit a little kid. And what you see is they're always making stuff. But not everybody outgrows it. And that's essentially what an artist is, from my point of view. It's just someone who never quite outgrew this urge to constantly be making, drawing, painting, constructing things, playing with Legos, it's whatever, making tree forts. Making goes to the heart of what we are, who we are. We were made by a maker to be makers, and our hearts are restless until we make something beautiful. So I really loved my older brother Billy and my cousin Johnny. They were big kids. And I wanted to be like them, but they were both athletes, and I liked to write poems and paint pictures. I was kind of a weird kid. But I've never outgrown this. I'm still doing it. But I wanted to show you that I was not a particularly talented kid. Here's the proof. I had a flair for the drama. I liked dressing up at Halloween, or any time of year, actually. And my grandson Tristan is here tonight, and he likes to do the same thing. But this is a Valentine I made for my dad and mom, and the thing I was most proud of in 5th grade was this spatter painting with actual leaves and a monogram, and these two figures, which were clumsy and really frustrated me, because whenever I drew a human face, I felt like, it doesn't look like a human being, it looks like something else. And so I was not particularly talented, but I had a deep drive to keep trying. And I think that may be what distinguishes an artist. When I was in high school, I switched gears a little bit and became a member of a garage band, actually a little more than a garage band, because we got a lot of gigs. We called ourselves, get this. And I was very, very proud of having painted our name on the bass drum. That was about the extent of my art ambition in those years, because I just wanted to play lead guitar and sing, and we played all the tunes of the 1960s. And I left home at the age of 17 and went to find jobs and just find my way in the world. The first car that I ever bought was a 1959 Morris Minor. And it's that peculiar little Woody wagon. It's like a Woody that shrunk. I think probably in this age, when you're a teenager, you want to be cool. And I think I tried really hard, which is that's not cool. But so something else happened in the 1970s. My wife and I were married. She was 19 and I was 20. And as she says, we were kids. But then we had kids right away. These are just a couple pictures that she took. She had a real flair for photography. When I was in college, for the very first time, I had a chance to get some instruction for my art. And this is the thing that I think, another thing that distinguishes artists from all the rest of us, is that they won't quit. They don't want to stop trying to get better. Most of us give up by about the time we're 8 years old. We're all artists until then. So the question then would be, what happened? Why did you stop trying? Well, I just didn't. So I'm going to sort of tell my story a little bit here. I kept trying. I kept trying to get better. And the very first self-portrait I did was, it was realistic. It was as realistic as I could make it. And when I did this painting, one of my fellow classmates said in front of everybody, "Bruce, why are you wearing that silly-looking leather hat all the time?" And I started to answer. I said, and my teacher came over and stood in front of me and said, "He wears it because the visor cuts down on the glare and it helps him see the color relationships better." I said, "Yeah, that's why." But actually, it was because I was playing the role of a cab driver, because I was actually driving a cab, making a living as a cab driver at the time. But in art school, you're expected to do a lot of self-portraits. And so what happened for me, I wonder if this happens for others when they're doing this, I started to get little insights, not just into how I appeared, but who I was. And so there's this gradual descent into a more interior way of seeing the self for me. And you'll see this progression so that there's a kind of a loss of detail, but a deepening of feeling, I think, that started to happen in my work. Finally, when I entered grad school, I began to become aware of the work of people like Georges Rouault and Max Beckmann and Pablo Picasso and all the expressionistic painters of the early 20th century, and I was smitten with their work. And so I moved away from naturalistic rendering, the kind of what we call realism, and I did it on purpose. I wanted to find a way to get at that inscape, that interior life. That also led to attempting to do images that tell a story about that inner life, the life of dreams and nightmares. And so you see a real change, a massive change took place in my work. These are little paintings I just showed you. They're about 14 inches square. They were damaged. Most of my work was destroyed in a house fire. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. These actually survived, which is a miracle because they're made of hot wax. So you would think they would have melted, but they were in a part of the basement that was sequestered away from the hottest part of the fire. They just got covered with soot. So I was able to clean them. But these little paintings kind of gave birth to some very big, ambitious paintings that I was doing my last year in graduate school. I began to give more ambitious titles, too. Around this time, a dear friend of mine and I approached a real estate agent or holder who owned a series of empty old mill buildings, Larry Pollins, who had been my sculpture teacher in undergraduate. Larry and I approached this guy and said, these are empty buildings. We're artists. We need space. Could we rent a space? He said, well, I'll give you 6,300 square feet. I can't remember what we were going to pay a month. And Larry and I looked at each other. We were both handy. And we said, well, would it be okay if we divided it up into separate studios? And what we did, we made 7 studios, and we both got a free studio out of the deal. And then other artists found out about it. The Boston Globe did a whole spread in the Boston Globe magazine about our studio, and then other artists flocked in. There were more artists, took up other floors of the building. And of course, you know what comes next. After the artists move in, they kick the artists out and they make it into luxury apartments. That's exactly what happened. My friend Larry we both lived in Dorchester at the time. This was the name of it was the old Baker's chocolate mills. You know, Baker's chocolate your grandma used to make fudge and frosting. And the floor that we were on was the floor that stored all the cocoa beans. And so on a hot summer day, you could smell the beans, even though they were long gone. So that was the period of after grad school, early 1980s. I was beginning to explore what I'd call these interior landscapes or inscapes of probably, I guess you'd call it a psychological narrative. They're not straightforward, but I gave them titles as hints. Like the one on the right, no, the left, my right, The Bribe, was about a kind of an interior sense of making a Faustian bargain in order to become a great painter. And I think a lot of poets and painters and filmmakers and composers go through a period where they feel like, I'm never going to be great unless I, what? ... And it may be that that's where corruption can come into the thing, or it becomes you fraternize with just the right people, or you become part of the right parties, the influential gallerist or museum curator. And so your motives for making your work start to get compromised. Well, I was battling with that. Most of my reason for making art was always coming from this place of desire, of sincere desire, since I was a little boy. But when you become a professional, you need to make a mark in the world. You need to make a name for yourself. You know where that comes from, that phrase, make a name for yourself? It comes from the story in the Old Testament of the builders of the Tower of Babel. Come, let us make a name for ourselves and build a tower reaching unto the heavens. It's about hubris. It's a story about hubris, like a lot of the Greek tragedies. Making a name for yourself. Well, it was something I was wrestling with. It was also probably subverting my relationships, my family, in ways that I knew was not quite right, but I couldn't quite figure out how to get around it. Right around this time, I came to faith and began to see everything in a different light. And you could see kind of a shift took place. I actually made this kind of naive assumption that because I had become a person of faith, I needed to go back to painting nature again. So I literally started doing landscape paintings and portraits, and like this portrait of my wife, Meg. But then I sort of came to my senses and realized, no, actually, that's not the kind of artist that I am. I still have to deal with those interior conflicts, those what literary folks call demons, your inner demons. How did I do that? Well, I began reading the Bible kind of like someone who's never knew anything about religion. And that's still the way I read the Bible, truth be told. I don't read it from the standpoint of settled beliefs, like check-boxed beliefs. I read these stories and I'm overwhelmed by them. The story of Cain and Abel, oh my gosh. How many films could be made? Oh, actually, how many films have been made? How many stories have been written that are about this tendency that we have to try to do each other in because we're jealous, or because we want power, or we want money? I was particularly drawn to Christ and to the story of his suffering, and so tried to find a fitting form for that. Around the same time, our house burned down in the 90s, and most of my art went up with it. Almost all of it was destroyed in a matter of hours. The only paintings that survived the fire were these ones I just showed you, the ones about Good Friday, the crowning of thorns, the crucifixion, the flogging. The reason they survived is that my friend Mark Stevick had come to my studio the day before and said, Bruce, can you pull out those Christ paintings? I want to look at them. And that day he bought a painting and took it with him. So those were out of the storage racks and they were in the studio, which had a firewall between the studio and the house. But of course, the firewall was to protect the house from the studio because I was handling solvents. But it did the opposite. It protected the studio from the house fire. So all that got into the studio was heat and smoke. No fire went in there. So these paintings survived. And I came down around the house while the house was actively burning and the firemen were trying to put out the fire. And I saw a bunch of firemen carrying my paintings, these paintings, out of the studio and putting them on the yard outside. And I said, guys, you're risking your lives. This is just art. And they said, no, we can do this. We can do this. And they brought them out. Something really strange happened. Lots of weird things happened that day. It was lightning that took out our house. But all these paintings were large. They're about this big. They're works on heavy-duty paper, which were framed behind plexiglass. Well, the plexiglass melted and turned black and bubbly and sagged down in the frame. So the paintings were completely unharmed. There was no smoke damage, nothing. So we've never figured out quite why they weren't, because everything else was either burned or smoke damaged. But after that fire, well, I should go back. After the fire, my imagery changed dramatically, and I began dealing with what I've come to call angels and other strangers. Gave titles like this, Lovers in a Dangerous Time. It's a take from a Bruce Cockburn song, a Canadian songwriter. I saw Satan fall from heaven, from Jesus' words, prayer and distraction. But the other thing that happened after the fire, one of my students was the one that pointed this out to me. He said, Professor Herman, your paintings have gotten very hot. Oranges and reds. They went from blues and purples and grays and whatnot to these hot colors, and that was totally unconscious. But I continued to do paintings during the early 2000s that dealt with this idea of ruination, of brokenness, of things falling apart, things kind of coming unglued, or somehow understanding, for example, in the case of this painting, Elegy for Bonhoeffer, that somehow in the midst of suffering, in the midst of loss, in the midst of breakage, there can be deep meaning. And I don't know if you know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but he was executed by the Nazis because he became part of the plot to assassinate Hitler, but also because he'd been preaching and teaching in a seminary against the kind of crazy, power-hungry conflation of religion and politics, which was happening in Germany at that time. Here's a detail. You can sort of make out the gulag there, the Auschwitz. It's really Auschwitz in the background there. I had gone to Auschwitz in 1979 And it was a traumatic encounter for me. And you know that yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the liberation. Why is he hanging upside down? He was hung by the neck by the Nazis. But somehow when I started the painting, I realized, no, I can't just literally paint a man being hung. So I hung him upside down, and he's descending into gold. This is all gold leaf. And I don't know, it was an intuitive choice. Well, it was a curator in a museum who was hanging this work, said to me, so are you saying that Bonhoeffer descended into glory? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm saying. But you know, a lot of times artists are vehicles for something bigger than themselves. They barely know what they're actually painting. They're more trying to get at something like an itch that's deep inside, and they don't necessarily have all the language to surround it with. Tonight, Bill Cross will explain everything when he's interviewing me. Right, Bill? This is, I'm going to just show you a handful of paintings with close-ups that were, for me, kind of breakthroughs. This one entitled Called. This is the model for this painting is Elisa Lardani, who was the sister of my friend Alessandro in Orvieto, Italy. Elisa died in childbirth some years ago, but she is revered in the city of Orvieto as a true saint. She was just one of those people who you knew when you were around her that she was holy. She just loved unconditionally. And she willingly gave her life for her baby, who is Magdalene. And Magdalena is now probably in her teens, right, John? Is that right? I think so. Here's another breakthrough painting that I began. It was just a completely abstract painting initially, but I thought I saw vestiges of some figure, and I just had to go in, and it sort of came to me. This is my daughter. And I took a photograph of Sarah on the night before her wedding in her wedding dress. And so it became this painting, Betrothed. But it's not just about her. It's really, well, I'll leave it up to you. My feeling is it's about our desire for completion, our desire to enter into relationship. And that's what I started off saying this evening, is that it's that unguarded gaze. When you let down your guard, what happens is you're flooded with wonder. You're flooded with color, with light. And that's what we need to do. We need to let down our guard. We've become very guarded in this society for lots of good reasons. We're getting tough, because you have to be tough when you're an adult. But the thing about artists is we never quite get tough enough. And so you find, because we stay at this place of wonder, a lot of artists are, unstable. I think it's literally goes with the territory a little bit. This is from a series I did on the Virgin Mary. I'd never seen an image of her receiving the seed of the Messiah, this miraculous child that the angel announced that she was going to give birth to. I'd never seen a picture of it, so it just came to me that the angel Gabriel said to her, "You'll be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit." But I read somewhere else in the Bible that there is no shadow in God. God is light. So I had the idea of maybe surround her with gold, surround her with light rather than shadow. But that's the center panel of a triptych that reads like Hebrew from right to left. This is the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. Then there's the time when she receives the Christ, the miraculous child, into her womb, and then when she visits her cousin or her relative Elizabeth, who was also pregnant with John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. Talk about a family legacy, right? But maybe you've seen the images of Mary as a kind of a gated garden or as an enclosed vessel. She puts her hand on top of the vessel because she's a virgin. She says, how can this be? Another painting I did in that same series about the Virgin Mary is called Second Adam. And at least my understanding of the painting, and I would trust anyone's interpretation, but my understanding is that this is Adam in the foreground and the second Adam on the cross. This is Eve in the foreground on the right-hand panel, and the second Eve, the Mater Dolorosa, the grieving mother. And then the young Mary over on the other side, kind of a mirror image of herself on this side. Mary at Cana with the water jugs that someday might become the miraculous wine. If anyone ever told you that you shouldn't drink wine if you're a Christian, tell them Jesus made 180 gallons of the best wine that was ever made because he invented grapes. Here it is installed at the Monastery San Paolo in Orvieto, and most recently at the Church of the Incarnation in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Temporary, they had it for several months. Seemed to fit there. I thought they should buy it, right? Yeah. But a bunch of collaborative work has come since then with a composer, Chris Theophanidis from Yale, who Sarita knows, and Mako Fujimura, another painter, and a theologian, Jeremy Begbie. And that project toured all over the place, to England, to Hong Kong, to Japan, and all over the United States. A more recent collaboration was with Malcolm Guite and Jack Redford, the composer. Malcolm's a poet, Ordinary Saints. And then last week, Empty Canvases. And then a couple days later. So I'm 72 years old. I've been doing this for more than a half a century, and I still haven't got a clue what I'm supposed to do next. And I'm okay with that. I can live with the uncertainty. But I started these paintings a couple days ago, painting on them all at the same time, kind of crazily, and they're reminiscent of the things that I did when I got out of grad school. And it reminded me of this wonderful passage at the end of Four Quartets where Eliot says, "With the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning, at the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick, now, here, now, always a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well when the tongues of flame are enfolded in a crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." Bill, come on up.
Thank you, Bruce. That was great. In some ways, this conversation is just two close friends talking about a wonderful new creation, this book, but it's also an opportunity for you to reflect on a number of years of making and of discovering your nature, if I can play off the title a little bit. What led you to this book, which is, as Malcolm Guite's foreword suggests, in a tradition? Why this book, and who do you hope will read it?
Well, I hope the 20 people I wrote to the book will read it, and the folks that are here tonight. But why this book? Well, it's a funny story. The publisher approached me about 5 years ago and said, "We want you to write they knew that I had taught here at Gordon and had started the art program and stuff, and they wanted me to write an academic essay in defense of the visual arts in a liberal arts curriculum." And I said, "Nope, not interested. I've done that for 40 years, and I'm moving on. Besides, I think there are people who are better at that." So they said, well, they came back to me 3 years ago, and said, "Bruce, if you're going to write a book, what would it be?" And I said, I'll get back to you. And the next morning I woke up and I had this idea. You know, I write letters all the time. Some of my correspondents are in this room. I'll write letters and see what comes of it. And so the editor said, well, write a couple of them, send them to me. Let me shop it around with the editorial committees. And I sent them 3 letters, and they wrote back immediately within a week and said, we want you to do this book. Get on it. And so I started. I didn't get very far because I was in the middle of a commission that I was finishing up. And then I had a hiking accident that summer, 2023, that landed me in really rough shape. So I couldn't do anything. I couldn't paint. I couldn't even lift a spoon to feed myself. But miraculously, I could sit and type. So I finished the book in 2 months and sent it to the publisher, expecting them to come back and say, you have to do these revisions, et cetera. And they said, we like it as is. So there it is. It kind of, the thing wrote itself. But as to who I hope will read it, I hope anybody, but especially younger artists, you know.
So you touched in your remarks on suffering that you have experienced, and as you alluded to the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the broader topic of suffering. And you also allude in one of the letters to Adorno's famous statement that writing poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. You have a different approach. Can you talk a bit about the role of suffering in your life, and also, since this book seemed to be so easy for you to write, you know, how we can think about beauty and suffering in ways that you have come to understand?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I don't think that Adorno meant that literally, but I think he was making a point, which is that, you know, after Auschwitz, you need to come to grips with what happened, you know, with this horror of the murder of 6 million Jews and others. But I think the bigger question is, what role does the arts, poetry, painting, music, have to play in a broken and really messed up world when things seem to be coming unglued and meaning itself seems to be at stake. And I don't think any of the people in this room are strangers to this, because I think that's the world we're living in. So the question is, what purpose beauty? What purpose art? And I actually think that the best art almost always comes out of an era in which things are not going great, because we have this need to go deeper. And do you need that? Oh, was your mic not working?
I guess not.
Or it's on. Okay.
So,
Thanks.
I mean, just to summarize that, I would just say, I think art is not a luxury item. It's not something for when things are going great and you just want to adorn your life with a nice thing. It's actually more for this coming to grips with reality, and coming to grips with suffering. And at the same time, yes, I think some art is for escape. I think it's to bring pleasure and to just sort of get outside of yourself because when you're living in a broken and troubled world, your temptation is always going to be to withdraw. And this is the opposite of what I was arguing for in my little talk there, to let down your guard. How do you let down your guard when you're afraid or when it doesn't feel safe? And I think music does that for us. Music makes us let down our guard. It goes right into it's the one art form that goes straight into our nervous system, and it opens us up. But I think if you can slow down enough to look at a painting carefully, it can do something similar.
And that's a very countercultural thing to do, to slow down and look long.
Yeah.
So you and I have been talking about this book for several years. It's out now, and it's wonderful. And I'm wondering how you yourself have been surprised both by the experience of reading it and by the contact you've had with people who have found it meaningful.
Thanks. Actually, the almost slightly embarrassing fact is that I haven't read it. I read it, I wrote it, and I didn't edit it. I gave it to a dear friend who's here tonight, David Cottingham, who cleaned it up. And, where all the jots and tittles were missing, he put in the jots and the tittles. But no, I literally haven't read the book, Bill. I read one letter a couple days ago, and my reaction was, that's pretty good. I feel that way sometimes when I look at the paintings. I go, who did that?
Well, maybe we should have another conversation about that a few months down the road after you've had more of an opportunity to talk with all the people who will find this book meaningful. As I know that some people have already bought copies of the book, but they're all signed outside, and you'll be able to do some personalized inscriptions afterwards for people that want more than your signature, right?
Invite, if there's any questions from you all in the audience. I know that the tech guys have a couple of microphones. If anyone has a comment or a question, we'd love to ask Bill, if you have a question.
Yes, the first question comes from Tristan.
Yeah, and there's a microphone coming. This is my grandson. So glad, Tristan, you have a question.
My question is actually for my grandfather. So when you were a kid, why did you not as much want to draw you thought you weren't that good at drawing pictures of people, but now almost on every single of your paintings, is there a person?
Yeah, thank you, Tristan. That's a good question. I'm going to try to respond. So you can sit down. Thank you. So let me say back the question, and Bill, you tell me if I got it right, because my hearing isn't great. Tristan, I think what you were asking about is, when I first started drawing as a kid, I couldn't draw faces very well and didn't like them. I didn't think they looked very good. But I've spent a long time learning how to draw faces, and now I do a lot of faces in my paintings, right? Is that what you were saying? And what was the question in that?
That's right. How did you make that transition? And not only that you now draw and paint faces, but the human figure, the body, has meaning to you in a way that has developed over your lifetime. How'd I do, Tristan?
That's a great question, Tristan. So here's what I think. I think that as a little boy, I really, really wanted to be able to draw people like my grandpa and my grandmother, especially old people. I like their faces especially because the lines are say about who they are and where they've lived, and they've lived a long time. And I was very frustrated by those drawings. They didn't look anything like my grandma or my grandpa. So I just kept trying and eventually learned. But the reason I've come, as I've grown up, I've understood more why I was so wanted to draw my grandma and my grandpa is because I loved them and because I wanted to know who they were. Because if you really look at someone's face, it's like fingerprints. There are no two faces alike in the whole world. Even so-called identical twins are not identical. They just look more similar to each other than the rest of us. But I just find that amazing that there are no two faces alike. And so it says something about a human being, about who they are. That's what I'm drawn to. Thank you. That's so good.
As the rings of trees give an expression to the experience
The lines in the face.
of a tree, so do the lines on the face. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Wendy.
Microphone's coming.
Hi, it's just so wonderful. But I wanted to ask, Bill, you asked about the sort of interplay between beauty and suffering. And then the answer was pretty much about suffering. Do you see beauty in the suffering? Is it an antidote to the suffering? What's the relationship or the level of importance that beauty has in a world that is suffering?
Thank you for being so articulate. I could hear every word you just said. That's great. I would say that, well, when I was doing the paintings about Good Friday, about the crowning of thorns and the flogging and the crucifixion, I gained an insight into, it just came to me in the midst of making those works, that suffering, the suffering of someone who is innocent, is horrific. It's the worst thing that can happen in a way, because, you know, many of us who carry along a fair amount of guilt know that we actually in some ways are, you know, deserve some kind of, I don't know, retribution or suffering or whatever. But someone who's innocent, and it shocked me that these images we've gotten from art history of these crucifixions, and I mean, I grew up, I didn't believe in Christ. I wasn't a Christian. Most of my, you know, when I was in art school and I was involved in Eastern mysticism, but I think it was the beauty, the moral beauty of Christ's love. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." Right when he's in the middle of this, and I just there's a beauty there that's just unfathomable. And so that's part of the thing that moved me into this place of faith, was just coming to grips with this seeming contradiction, that there's this terrible suffering, this abuse of another human being who's actually innocent of all the charges heaped on him, and yet there's still love there. I'm not sure I can be a whole lot more articulate about it. There's a story by Dostoevsky that I highly recommend if you haven't read it, called The Idiot. It's about this guy, Prince Mishkin, who is the idiot. He's a kind of a Christ figure. But at the end of the story, you see him, Dostoevsky contrasts him with all these important people and literati and very rich folks and people of importance and power. And he's this guy that's sort of a bit vague and childlike. At the end, Prince Mishkin says, "Beauty will save the world." And I think what Mishkin means in the context is that without beauty, we will keep doing this to each other. It's just Cain and Abel over and over and over again. The beauty teases out of us this empathy, this desire to care, this desire to appreciate a beautiful world and a beautiful person. It's the best I can do. It's in the paintings, the real answer, you know. Other questions, comments?
Yes, sir.
Got the mic?
Thank you. Why do some paintings develop notoriety over time and others don't? And I'm wondering, is it due to the narrative that the artist provides, or is it a long period of time of public acknowledgement and a telling of a story that is done by a community? And, and the reason I ask is that there are some beautiful, beautiful paintings in the world that are not particularly noted. And when you see them, you wonder why.
And the obverse, which is, you know, there are some paintings that get a lot of attention that are, frankly, quite grotesque. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it's a complicated response that I would have to that. I think there is an element of when art gets written about by influential thinkers, it can somehow be promoted into a position of prominence. But I think the reason people are moved to write about it is often because there's something there that they can't get over, they can't get around. An example might be Guernica by Picasso, this colossal, really grotesque painting. And it's a powerful painting, it's an important painting, and I don't think anyone denies that. Even people that don't like modern art will say Guernica's important. Well, Picasso was interviewed by a journalist, asked him, so, Mr. Picasso, what was driving this painting? Were you outraged by the bombing of Guernica and you just had to give voice to this outrage and this sadness? And Picasso, being Picasso, said, it's not about that. It's not about the bombing of Guernica. It's about violence. I think there's something in paintings like that that go to the heart of something really important that we can't get over. And it may not be beautiful. Actually, I think Guernica is beautiful in a strange sort of way. But why paintings get neglected that are perfectly lovely? I don't know the answer to that. I think someone loves them, you know? And, you know, my personal ambition as an artist is not to be famous. It's just that someone would want my work and that it would be a place that they could meet something that they recognize as important, as significant, as beautiful, as touching, whatever. I mean, it almost doesn't matter to me who. I wouldn't be, and I'm not being disingenuous. The top critic for the New York Times, Roberta Smith, could write about my work. It wouldn't mean nearly as much to me as Tristan coming into my studio and saying, Opa, I think this is pretty good. Actually, my favorite comment I ever got about my work was from an 8-year-old kid, and his dad knew it was in an exhibition of my work, and his dad brought him in, and his dad saw me, and he was being a wise guy. He says, hey, Heath, tell me, what do you think of this painting? And he knew I was standing behind. Heath didn't know I was the artist, and Heath said, well, it's kind of crummy, but I like it. That's my favorite comment I've ever had about my work. I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question why, you know. The other thing that we know is that in our history, some work recedes and is unimportant for hundreds of years. Like Vermeer was completely forgotten for 120 years. Something similar happened to Rembrandt. Johann Sebastian Bach, the great artist of the fugue, completely unknown for over a century until Felix Mendelssohn discovered these manuscripts and republished them. So, I mean, some art disappears for a time and comes back. It's a bit of a mystery. It has a lot to do with where we are as a culture. I think we're in a place right now where people really need beauty, desperately, yeah. Other questions?
Yes.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Many years ago, you were with us for an event we did in Cambridge with Jason Herod and Brian Funk. You probably remember that. We were asking you this question about how do you experience the work of the Spirit and creativity. And at that time, you shared with us this idea that sometimes you're painting something and you have this sense of an evil presence in that process. And I wonder if you could say anything about your interior life and how you experience the work of the Spirit or God's presence as you're painting these days.
Thanks. I'm tempted to say what Picasso said when he was asked about the meaning of one of his paintings. He says, if I could explain it, I wouldn't have to paint it. But no, I do think, I think artists are sensitive. We pick up on things. We're kind of vessels or mediums through which truth or significance of some sort passes. I think most artists have this experience. There's a bunch of artists in this room, and I wonder if you think this way. Sometimes you step back from your own work and you say, where did that come from? I have no idea. And you're kind of amazed. So I think that's a kind of a universal experience with poets, with composers. They hear something and they try it out on the piano, and they go, it's like a seed of something that wants to become a work. Martin Buber, actually I'll read it to you, because Jeff, it has direct bearing on this. Martin Buber, in his book, I Am Thou, says, if I can find it here quickly, I'll read it to you. It says, this is the eternal origin of a work of art, that a human being confronts a form that wants to become a work through him. Not a figment of his soul, but something that appears to the soul and demands the soul's creative power. What is required is a deed that a human being does with her whole being. If she commits it and speaks with her being the basic word to the form that appears, then the creative power is released and the work comes into being. He goes on to say that if will and grace are combined at some point in the future, that dormant work that is sitting on a wall, say, comes to life, it flashes to life again when someone else comes and is receptive. I think artists are carriers. You know, the same way that there are people who are carriers of diseases. I think we are carriers of cultural diseases sometimes. Songwriters, I think of Bob Dylan. So many times in his work, I feel like I'm listening to my own conscience. I'm listening to my worst nightmares. That's part of what we do. We're there to be a channel for something bigger than ourselves. Yeah.
Yes, in the middle towards the back.
Hi, Bruce. You, in the painting that you showed, it was called The Bribe. And this wrestling with this temptation to make a name for yourself. What has that been like for you over the years with that wrestling?
Thank you. Well, I took an exit from that world pretty quickly when I started to make a name for myself. I got my first write-up in the Boston Globe and started selling my work to important collectors in Boston and got invited to parties and dinners and stuff that we just weren't our people to feel comfortable with. So I sort of made an exit. Meg and I moved from Dorchester back up here to the North Shore to Gloucester. And I stumbled into this job at Gordon College because there was no art department here. I met a guy that was teaching English here, and he told me he taught at Gordon College, and I said, where's that? And he said, it's only 10 minutes from here. What do you mean, where is it? I said, what kind of a school is it? And he said, it's a 4-year Christian liberal arts college. I said, what's that? I'd never heard of such a thing. I said, do they have an art department? And he said, no. I said, it's a liberal arts college and there's no art department. He said, I'm giving you the name of the academic dean and his phone number. Tell him what you think of that. And I just had the chutzpah to call the number, and I said, hi, Paul Borgman told me to call you and ask you about the art department. I found out later that they were roommates in college and they didn't get along. So it was the wrong name to drop, you know. But the dean was intrigued by this phone call, and he said, well, send me a letter of interest. He said, we don't have an art department. I can't guarantee that anything will come of it, but if you send me a letter. So I wrote my story, a little bit of my story, about a page and a half, and sent it to him along with slides of my work. Back then we used 35 millimeter slides. And he didn't get back to me, so 2 months later, being the nervy guy that I am, I called him up and said, hey, did you ever get that letter? And his secretary answered, and she said, oh, Bruce Herman, yeah, actually I have a memo here to contact you because the dean wants you to come in and meet the faculty senate. And I had no idea what the faculty senate was. It was a group of august professors who were making decisions about who gets hired, and I was a bit nonplussed. I walked in and for about 10, 15 minutes, I got grilled by these folks, and then I started grilling them. And I said, so what are you doing for your talented kids that come to this school, or the families of the school? And they said, well, not much. I said, well, don't you think that artistically talented kids need to be challenged and developed and trained? And so we had this great conversation, and an hour and a half later, I left. This 20-minute meeting that took an hour and a half, and then next thing I knew, the dean called me and said, we want you to teach 4 classes next year. This was in June. I started that fall, 1984, taught 4 classes that year, and he said, no guarantees, but start putting together a curriculum. Maybe we'll get a department. And that kept me going, you know? It kept me from needing to make a name for myself. I was able to sort of empty myself into my students, which is really what I wanted to do anyway. I never really wanted to be a player in the sense of making a living as an artist. That is, you know, having to go through all that rigmarole of branding and stuff. So I think teaching was a good solution for me. Unfortunately, for some people that take up teaching, they stop making art. I didn't. I never stopped. I couldn't. This is what I was made for, so I just kept going. What success I've had has been seemingly accidental. I mean, it just seems to have come without a lot of effort on my part, other than just showing up in the studio and pushing gooey, sticky colored stuff around on a canvas, you know.
Peter.
I have a question that
This guy doesn't even need a microphone.
I'm going to have to sort of help. Witness as a nation the fires that have been burning mostly north of Los Angeles during the past couple of weeks, and the horrific extent of those fires and the amount of destruction. And perhaps some of us know people or have people in our family who have lost homes there. I know that's true in my case. But as I'm thinking of you and the fact that you lost your house to a fire and lost a tremendous amount of artwork, it struck me that I know that the houses that burned down contained huge amounts of artwork that that many of the owners there, some of whom I know, had tremendous collections of art in their homes, and those are gone. And now we are, you know, everybody's casting blame and upon everybody else, and it's we're talking about insurance and rebuilding and all that kind of thing, but I haven't heard one person talk about the loss of artwork, and I wonder what you would have to say to people who have, in addition to losing their homes and so forth, have lost perhaps their own artwork that they've created or the artwork of others that can never be replaced.
Thank you, Peter. I don't know that I have any great words of wisdom or comfort. I think probably when stuff like this happens, it's like when a death happens, you just go and hang out with people. You don't offer them any great insights or any attempts to explain, or I mean, the biggest comfort is just to be there. So I think those people in California, hopefully many of them are finding friends and family to be with and just grieve, you know, because there's a real grief there. In my case, it was a little, I don't know whether it's just the way I'm hardwired, but it was inconvenient to lose all that stuff, but I knew I was going to keep making art. And in some ways, it kind of felt, this is going to sound weird, it felt a little bit like covering my tracks in the sand. That was gone. I can start over again. I know some other artists in Boston who have had fires that have been devastated by them. Others have had a different reaction, more like my own, which is just liberated to keep making work. Yeah, I think it's individual how people react to the loss of possessions. And the biggest thing is you don't want to lose your loved ones. You don't want to lose even your pets or your. I saw pictures in the news of horses running in the fire. It just was heartbreaking to think about animals not being able to get away, and then all the wildlife, and yeah, it's pretty horrible. But and we try to move forward. Yes, behind you, Phyllis.
That's what fascinated me. As you moved through your life, your palette changed and the colors changed. And it was so interesting when you started using more gold um, to illuminate more light, perhaps. Um, Perhaps you would talk about that.
Sure. I mean, the choice to use gold leaf was an intuitive one, and it was partly a response to looking at, Meg and I lived in Italy for about 6 months after grad school, and I got to go to all those museums, the Uffizi and the Accademia, and the place that we loved the most was the Monastery San Marco, where Fra Angelico's work was. And I think it was being in close proximity to great religious art that that communicated something beyond what you think of as a typical religious. I don't even know if there is a typical religiosity, but where the sincerity of purpose was there in Fra Angelico, that just absolutely thrilling to me. That he was a servant of the brothers in that monastery. He had a job to do. He was a painter. And I think part of my desire all my life has not been to be a celebrity or to have my name in lights or whatever. It's just been to be a servant, to make work that matters to other people. And so I think the gold leaf came, and some of those palette changes came from being in close proximity to the work of great religious painting, like that of Fra Angelico and others. It may have also just been instinctual. Like I said, it was a student of mine that noticed the big change, so that post-fire, your work got very fiery. I think artists often, you probably better to ask Bill. He probably knows, he's got a better answer for you. I mean, that's why we have art historians and art critics. I mean, Bill has written an amazing book on the life of Winslow Homer, American Passage, with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. I highly recommend you get it if you don't. You know who Winslow Homer is, great New England painter. It takes someone who's sensitive like you, Bill, to unpack the work.
So you touch in the book, I'm looking particularly at the third letter to Ella, at the idea that God has a love language. And so just as each human has a dignity because each of us is made in the image of God, he is a maker and we are makers. How can we emulate Homer's powers of observation? How can we take the contrarian, countercultural step as we wake up tomorrow morning in a place marked by the fingerprints of the maker?
Yeah.
How can we slow down? What practical ways can we look longer at God's creation and thereby perhaps look longer at the creations of one another? And why don't we maybe end at that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to say a word about God here, is that I think all of our notions about God need to be revised every generation. I think we get stuck in ideas about God. We try to box God. And I'm not anti-religion. I think human beings need religion the way they need sleep and food and procreation. I mean, it's just, if you look at the history of the human race, we are religious beings. We want to worship. That's how we're made. But I think if we really want to know the Creator, if we want to model ourselves after the Creator, and live out that image that in Genesis said he created them male and female in his own image, we need to be open. We need to let down our guard. We need to stop trying to box God in, but even more importantly in a way, stop boxing each other in. You know, the Democrat box or the Republican box or the Christian box or the Muslim box. Get rid of the boxes, I want to say. I'm a Facebook guy. I recently put something on Facebook. There's no them, there's only us. I really believe that. I really believe that the best way to slow down, the best way to become more connected to our world and to one another is to stop boxing each other in. Stop trying to objectify one another and stop trying to objectify the world, but enter into a relationship. That's why this is practically a Bible to me, this I and Thou by Martin Buber. It's an amazing book. It's not easy to read because it's so simple. It's so simple that it just breaks your brain. But essentially what Buber says in this book is that you have two choices. You can be in relationship to the world as toward a thou or towards a you, or you can be in relationship to things and others in the world as an it, I and it. So there are these two postures, I, it, and I, thou. I actually think if the arts have anything to offer us, it's to move us again and again and again into the I, thou posture, instead of objectifying one another and objectifying the world and, like I said, boxing each other in. Instead, let down your guard. Let your gaze be a gaze of love. That's what I feel very deeply. But thank you. And thank you all for coming. We're going to be up there signing books.
Well done.
Yes, thank you, Bruce and Bill. Thank you all for joining us this evening for your wonderful questions. The evening's not over. If you'll head back up the stairs, you'll be able to purchase a book. Bruce will be signing. There's a light reception up there as well. So just grateful to all of you for joining us. While you're up there are season brochures for the Adams School. And right now in the gallery, there's an exhibition, the Horology and Religion exhibition, and a symposium all day on Saturday. So hope you can join us for that too. Thank you for being here this evening.